If you saw Miles Donovan for the first time, you would think he was simply a quiet man, living alone at the edge of a small New England town. Every morning he opened his workshop before sunrise and bent over an old watch with a jeweler's loop pressed to his eye. Every evening he sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the maple trees shed their leaves onto the wet street. For 11 years, his old blue pickup truck sat in the driveway, rarely driven, never carrying a passenger. Nobody in town knew why. Then, on a gray afternoon in late October, with rain falling in thin silver threads over the rooftops, a woman he had never met knocked on his door and asked him a question that would change both of their lives before the night was over. She only wanted a ride into town. Miles said yes. Neither of them understood, in that moment, that 15 quiet minutes in a truck would undo years of silence. The town itself seemed built for slow living, a place where the church bell still rang twice on Sundays, and the hardware store owner remembered every customer's name without a ledger. Streets narrowed as they climbed toward the hills, lined with clapboard houses painted in fading blues and whites, their porches sagging gently under the weight of decades. In autumn, the whole valley turned the color of embers, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from chimneys long before the first frost arrived. It was the kind of place where everyone recognized everyone else's car, but almost nobody recognized what was underneath a person's habits. People waved from across the street without slowing down, certain they already knew the whole story of their neighbors, certain that nothing much ever changed there. Miles kept his lawn trimmed and his gutters clean. His fences painted every third spring whether they needed it or not. He waved at every neighbor who passed, always with the same short nod, the same half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. He fixed the mailbox for the widow across the street without being asked, replaced her porch light bulb before she even noticed it had gone out, and left a bag of rock salt by her door on the first icy morning of every winter. He shoveled snow from an elderly couple's driveway before dawn, so they would never see him doing it, always finished and gone by the time their curtains opened. And yet, in 11 years, no one had ever been invited inside his house. No friend's car had ever parked in his driveway overnight. No laughter had ever spilled out from behind his windows, and no one could recall a single holiday when his chimney sent up smoke for company rather than solitude. People called him kind. They also called him strange. In the gentle way small towns describe men they cannot quite explain. The way they speak of a locked room in an otherwise open house. Children on the street liked him without understanding why, sensing something steady in him that adults, busier with their assumptions, often missed entirely. He was, to nearly everyone who thought about him at all, a good man with a closed door where his past should have been. Vivian Sinclair arrived on a Tuesday, in a car too polished for the cracked pavement of that street, hauling 2 suitcases and a silence of her own. She was 37 years old and had built, from nothing, a boutique hotel chain with her name stitched into every embroidered pillow across 6 cities, a name that once meant something in rooms full of investors in champagne. Then, within the span of 4 months, a business partner she trusted had emptied half her accounts, a fiancé she trusted more had vanished with him, and the life she had spent 15 years constructing collapsed into headlines and lawsuits she still could not read without her hands trembling. Reporters had camped outside her old apartment for nearly 3 weeks. And even after they left, the silence they left behind felt worse than the noise ever had. She bought the small house next to Miles Donovan's without ever seeing it in person, because it was far from everything, and far was exactly what she needed. The listing photos had shown little more than a modest colonial, with peeling shutters and an overgrown garden. But something about its quiet had appealed to her from behind a screen, 300 miles away, in a lawyer's office full of other people's opinions about her future. She noticed her new neighbor on her second morning, a broad-shouldered man kneeling in his garden, moving with the unhurried patience of someone who had nowhere else he needed to be. It struck her, watching him through her kitchen window with a coffee she had not yet unpacked mugs for, how foreign that kind of stillness felt to her now. She asked Naomi Brooks about him over a coffee that first week, mostly out of boredom, mostly because the silence of her new house was louder than she expected. Once the moving trucks pulled away, Naomi ran the small cafe on Elm Street and had watched half the town grow up, grow old, or grow tired, pouring coffee behind the same counter for nearly 20 years. She told Vivian that Miles Donovan was the kindest man anyone knew, and also the loneliest, in the same breath, as though the two facts had simply always belonged together in his case. She said he had moved to town years ago with almost nothing, opened a small workshop restoring antique clocks and watches, and never once mentioned a wife, a family, or a single friend from wherever he had come from. Vivian laughed it off as small-town gossip and went back to unpacking boxes she did not yet have the strength to open, most of them still labeled in her assistant's handwriting from a life she was trying to leave behind. She told herself she had come here to disappear quietly, not to collect the mysteries of strangers, and yet something about the image of that closed, careful man stayed with her longer than she expected. She had no idea, walking back to her new front door under a darkening sky that smelled of rain, that within days her own car would die in the middle of that same quiet, rain-soaked street, and that the mystery she had dismissed so easily would soon knock, uninvited, straight into the center of her life. The storm arrived without warning on a Thursday evening. The kind of New England rain that turned gutters into rivers and streetlights, into blurred halos, hanging low over the road. Vivian had an emergency call from her attorney in the city, one final chance to salvage records before a hearing that could determine whether she kept anything at all, and the meeting could not wait until morning. Her car refused to start, coughing once under the hood before falling completely silent, no matter how many times she turned the key. Her phone battery blinked at 4%, the charger still buried somewhere in an unlabeled box. And the taxi company did not answer, no matter how many times she called. The only bus had already left for the night, its taillights long gone by the time she checked the schedule twice. Certain she had misread it, she stood on her porch for a long moment, watching the rain fall sideways under the street lamp, before she finally crossed the wet grass toward the one house on the street, with its porch light still on. Her heels sank slightly into the softened ground, and she hesitated at the base of his steps, suddenly aware of how strange it would seem. A stranger begging a favor from a man the whole street called private. She knocked twice before Miles opened the door. A folded newspaper, still in one hand, reading glasses pushed up into his gray-streaked hair, his expression unreadable in the dim light behind him. She explained the situation quickly, almost apologetically, certain he would say no, certain a man who spoke to no one would not want a stranger in his truck, certain this had been a mistake the moment the words left her mouth. He listened without interrupting, studied her for a moment the way he studied a broken watch, before deciding how to open it, his eyes moving briefly to the rain behind her and back to her face again, and said only one word. "Okay." He grabbed his keys from a hook by the door, pulled on a canvas jacket already worn soft at the elbows, and walked out into the rain as though her emergency had simply become his own, without negotiation, without hesitation, without a single question about why it mattered so much or who she really was. The truck's engine rattled to life on the second try, and the two of them pulled out into a night blurred by water and headlights, the wipers struggling to keep pace with the storm. Vivian noticed immediately how clean the interior was for a vehicle so old. No fast food wrappers, no dust on the dashboard, everything wiped down and cared for like an instrument, rather than a machine that simply carried a man from one place to another. On the bench seat between them sat two antique pocket watches wrapped in soft cloth and a worn paperback about the history of New England shipping routes. Its spine cracked from repeated reading. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes, the silence broken only by the wipers and the low hum of the heater fighting off the cold outside. She finally asked him what he did for a living, mostly to fill the silence that had begun to feel heavier than the rain itself, and he told her he restored old clocks and watches, pieces that other people had already given up on. She asked how long he had lived in town, and he answered simply, "A long time," without offering a single detail beyond it. His eyes fixed steadily on the road ahead. He was not cold, she realized, watching the careful way his hands rested on the wheel, only careful, the way some men become after learning that words, once spoken, can never be taken back. She found herself, against every instinct built by months of betrayal, trusting the silence of a man she had known for less than 20 minutes. When they reached the office building downtown, he pulled up exactly at the curb, waited until she was safely under the awning before pulling away, and drove off before she could properly thank him for what he had done. It was only later that night, back in her freezing house with the meeting behind her and the rain still tapping against her windows, that Vivian realized her wallet was missing and understood it must still be sitting on the bench seat of a stranger's truck. She searched her bag twice more out of habit, though she already knew, and sat down heavily on an unpacked box, wondering whether the day could possibly hold one more complication. She barely had time to panic before headlights swept across her living room curtains, cutting through the dark like a question she had not yet asked. Miles Donovan stood on her porch at nearly 11 at night, rain dripping from the brim of his cap onto the boards beneath his boots, holding her wallet out toward her, without a word of explanation needed. She opened it immediately, out of old habit more than suspicion, and found every bill exactly where she remembered leaving it. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed, not even the loose receipts tucked into the back fold. She offered him $20 for the trouble of driving back out in the storm, folding the bills before he could refuse them outright. Miles finally met her eyes directly for the first time that night, rain still beating on his jacket. And there was nothing performative in what he said next. "Help when you can," he told her quietly, his voice low and steady beneath the sound of the rain. "That's all." He turned to leave, and as he did, something slipped from the inside pocket of her wallet and fluttered onto the wet porch boards between them, catching briefly in the porch light before it landed. It was a small, faded photograph, its edges softened by years of handling, tucked so deep inside her wallet that even Vivian had forgotten it was there. A picture from a life she rarely thought about anymore. Miles bent down instinctively to pick it up and hand it back to her. But the moment his eyes landed on the image, he went completely still, one hand hovering above the wet wood, as though he had forgotten what he was reaching for. He stared at it far longer than the situation required, his jaw tightening, something moving behind his expression that Vivian could not name, something old and heavy passing briefly across his face like weather. She reached for the photograph gently, and he released it without meeting her eyes again, muttering a quick good night before walking briskly back into the rain, leaving Vivian standing alone on her porch with more questions than she had answered all evening. Curiosity, once planted, does not easily leave a person alone, and Vivian found herself thinking about that strange silence on Miles's face far more than she wanted to admit over the following days. 2 days later, she returned to Naomi's cafe, ordered a coffee she did not finish, and asked more questions than she had intended to ask when she first sat down. Naomi lowered her voice, glancing toward the window as though the subject himself might walk by at any moment on his way to the hardware store, and told Vivian what little the town actually knew for certain about the man next door. Miles had once worked in Boston, in a career nobody could quite name, earning enough that his old coworkers still spoke of him with a strange mixture of respect and confusion whenever they happened to visit family in town. Then, without warning, he resigned, sold nearly everything he owned, and disappeared into this small town with a truck, a toolbox, and almost nothing else worth mentioning. He had never dated anyone in the 11 years Naomi had known him, never mentioned parents, siblings, or old friends visiting from out of town, and never once brought a single guest to the small gatherings the street occasionally organized. He simply worked, helped, and waited for each day to end quietly, as though he were serving out some private sentence. Only he understood the terms of a debt he seemed determined to keep paying without ever explaining what it was for. Naomi admitted she had asked him once, years earlier, why he never talked about his past, and he had only smiled the way he always did, changed the subject, and paid for her coffee before she could ask again, the way he always found some quiet way to end a conversation he did not wish to have. It was Arthur Collins, the elderly man 3 houses down who spent his mornings on his porch watching the entire street unfold like a slow-motion film, who finally gave Vivian something worth following, Arthur told her, in the unhurried cadence of a man with nowhere left to rush toward. that there was exactly one day each year when Miles Donovan disappeared from town without explanation. He left before sunrise, returned well after dark, and never once mentioned where he had gone or why, no matter how gently or how often his neighbors had wondered aloud in passing. Arthur had wondered about it for years, had even considered asking directly on more than one occasion, but something about the look on Miles's face on those particular mornings had always stopped him before the question left his mouth. Vivian sat with that thought long after she left the cafe, turning it over the way Miles turned over the broken mechanisms of old watches, examining it from every angle it would allow. By the following week, she had made a decision she was not entirely proud of, one that surprised even her when she finally admitted it to herself over a second cup of coffee she barely tasted. She decided she would follow him, just once, just to understand the shape of the silence that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. The day came without warning, the way Arthur had described it would. Gray and quiet and heavy with the smell of wet leaves clinging to the pavement outside her window. Vivian watched from behind her curtains as Miles backed his truck out of the driveway just after 6 in the morning, dressed not in his usual work clothes but in a dark coat she had never seen before, one that seemed reserved for exactly this occasion. She followed at a careful distance, her heart pounding with something between guilt and determination, staying 2 turns behind him through streets that grew narrower and older, the farther they traveled from town, past fields gone brown, and fences leaning with age. His first stop was a small cemetery on a hillside. Its iron gate rusted at the hinges, where he knelt beside a modest gray headstone and stayed there in silence for nearly 20 minutes, his lips moving occasionally though no sound reached her from where she waited near her parked car. She watched him place his hand flat against the cold stone once, briefly, before rising and brushing the wet grass from his knees with the same careful patience he used on every broken mechanism that passed through his workshop. From the cemetery, he drove to a nursing home on the edge of the next county, a low brick building with faded blue shutters, and a garden gone slightly wild with autumn, its walkways littered with fallen leaves no one had yet raked. Vivian parked across the street and watched through the window as he signed in at the front desk with the easy familiarity of someone who had done it hundreds of times before, exchanging a few quiet words with the receptionist that made her smile in a way that suggested genuine fondness. His final stop was an old watch and clock repair shop, its windows dusty, its sign faded almost to illegibility, tucked between a shuttered bakery and an empty storefront that had clearly been empty for years. He carried a small bouquet of white flowers inside, cradled carefully against the wind, and Vivian, unable to stop herself now, crossed the street and stood close enough to the window to see what happened next through the grime-streaked glass. An elderly man rose slowly from a chair inside the shop the moment Miles stepped through the door, his hands trembling slightly with age, his eyes brightening in a way that suggested decades of memory behind them, memory that had clearly not dimmed for this particular visitor. He crossed the small space and wrapped his arms around Miles Donovan, and Miles, the same man who had never raised his voice or shown a flicker of emotion to anyone in 11 years, broke down completely in that old man's embrace, his shoulders shaking with a grief that seemed to have been waiting all year for permission to surface. Vivian stood frozen on the sidewalk, rain beginning to fall again in a fine mist, watching a man she had believed to be made entirely of quiet composure weep like someone finally allowed, for one day each year, to stop being strong. She had never seen him cry. She was certain, in that moment, standing alone in the rain outside a shop that time seemed to have forgotten, that almost no one alive had ever seen it either. Then the old man spoke, his voice carrying faintly through the glass, calling Miles by a word that stopped Vivian's breath entirely and rooted her feet to the wet pavement. He called him son. Vivian remembered clearly what Naomi had told her only days before, that Miles Donovan had no family left, no parents anyone in town had ever heard mentioned, no relatives who ever visited or called on holidays. She stood on that wet sidewalk, trying to reconcile the words she had just heard with everything she thought she understood about her neighbor, and realized, with a strange ache in her chest, that she understood almost nothing about him at all, that the quiet man next door was a far deeper mystery than any small-town rumor could explain. It was Miles himself, 3 days later. who finally offered her the truth, sitting across from her on her own porch, with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between them, while the last of the season's leaves drifted down around them. The old man's name was Walter Boone, he explained, and he was not Miles's father by blood, though the word had never felt inaccurate to either of them across all the years since. When Miles was 17, reckless and grieving after losing his own parents in a highway accident that still visited him some nights in dreams, he had wandered into the path of real danger one winter night, drifting too close to a frozen river's edge, with no particular reason to care what happened to him. Walter Boone, a stranger at the time, had pulled him from it without a second thought for his own safety, dragging him back onto solid ground and refusing to let go of his coat sleeve until they were both safely away from the ice. Walter had taken him in afterward, fed him, given him a bed in the back room of his repair shop above the ticking of 100 clocks, and never once made him feel like a burden or a charity case passing through on his way to somewhere else. He taught Miles everything he knew about clocks and watches, about patience, about the particular kind of care it takes to bring something broken back to working order without forcing it, about listening to a mechanism long enough to understand what it needed rather than what seemed easiest to fix. When Walter's hands began to shake too badly to hold a loop steady, and his memory began slipping in ways that frightened them both during long winter evenings, Miles walked away from a career that had made him wealthy in Boston without hesitation, without a single backward glance at the life he was leaving behind. He moved back, took over the old shop's overflow work from a small rented house nearby, and spent years quietly managing Walter's care, his medications, his good days and his increasingly difficult ones, learning to read the old man's confusion the way he once learned to read a broken clock face. By the time Walter stabilized in the nursing home Vivian had watched him visit, Miles had already built an entirely new, quieter life around him, and he had simply never found a reason to leave it, never found anything in his old world worth trading this one for. Vivian sat in silence long after he finished speaking, the coffee between them long since gone cold, understanding for the first time that his solitude had never been emptiness at all, only devotion with nowhere left to advertise itself, a kind of love that had simply chosen to work quietly, instead of loudly. It was only a week later that a man in an expensive gray suit knocked on Miles's door, introducing himself to Vivian, who happened to be standing nearby with a bag of groceries, as Ethan Mercer, an attorney representing a private charitable trust. He carried a leather folder thick with documents, letters, and financial records, glancing between the two of them as though uncertain which of them he was actually there to convince. He seemed almost surprised when Miles told him plainly, without even glancing at the folder, that he was not interested in whatever the papers inside it contained. Vivian, curious despite herself, asked Ethan directly what business he had with her quiet neighbor, setting her groceries down on the porch step, as though settling in for an answer. Ethan hesitated, glanced at Miles for permission that was clearly not going to be granted, and then, perhaps sensing an ally in Vivian's persistence, explained anyway, choosing his words carefully. For nearly a decade, Ethan revealed, Miles Donovan had been quietly funding scholarships for local students who could not otherwise afford college, all of it structured through the trust, so that no name was ever publicly attached to a single dollar. He had helped renovate the very nursing home where Walter now lived, covering costs the facility itself never publicized to its residents or their families, replacing outdated heating systems and adding a proper garden where residents could sit in the sun. He had donated, again and again, to the small community hospital 2 towns over, always anonymously, always routed through lawyers who understood he wanted nothing in return, not even a plaque with his name on it. Vivian looked at the man standing beside her, the same man who fixed neighbors' mailboxes before dawn and refused $20 for driving through a storm, and felt something in her understanding of him shift permanently, like a key finally turning in a lock she had not realized was there. She had come to this town believing she had lost nearly everything worth trusting, certain that generosity without an agenda no longer existed anywhere in the world she had left behind. And here, quietly, standing on his own porch, refusing paperwork he clearly did not want, was a man who had spent years giving away almost everything he had without once asking to be seen doing it, without ever collecting so much as a thank you for the trouble. Her own troubles, however, had not finished chasing her, and they caught up with her again barely a week later in the form of a certified letter she almost did not open, sitting unopened on her kitchen table for an entire evening before curiosity finally won out. The house she had bought, the one meant to be her fresh start far from the wreckage of the city, was tangled in a legal dispute from a previous owner's unresolved debts, one her rushed and distracted purchase had never uncovered during the chaos of leaving her old life behind. The bank was moving to reclaim it. Her old attorney in the city no longer returned her calls now that her name carried more liability than fee, and the few friends she had once trusted with expensive dinners and easy laughter had grown remarkably quiet themselves, their numbers going straight to voicemail whenever she tried them. Vivian sat alone in her half-unpacked living room with the letter in her lap, feeling the ground shift beneath her for the second time in less than a year, the same cold dread she remembered from the first collapse, spreading slowly through her chest. She wondered if she was simply someone destined to lose every home she ever tried to claim. Whether the universe had decided, somewhere along the way, that stability was not something meant for her. She did not sleep well that night, listening instead to the rain returning against her windows, thinking of nothing but numbers and dates and the particular cruelty of losing a home twice in 1 year. She did not ask Miles for help. She never had to. He appeared at her door the following evening with a legal pad and a list of 3 names. Men he had quietly reached out to, who might know how to untangle the county records that had caused the confusion in the first place. Over the following weeks, he drove her to the county courthouse twice, sat beside her through hours of tedious paperwork in rooms that smelled of old carpet and older bureaucracy, and tracked down an elderly former clerk whose memory of the original property transfer proved crucial in correcting the title once and for all. He never once suggested she owed him anything for it, never mentioned his own time or gas money again, simply showed up each morning with 2 coffees and a folder of new documents to review. When Vivian finally asked him outright, exhausted after another long afternoon at the courthouse, why he kept helping people who could offer him nothing in return, his answer was as simple as everything else about him. Because someone once helped me, he told her, when I had absolutely nothing to give back. His voice quiet but certain, as though the debt he was still repaying had never once felt like a burden to carry. It was around that same time that Vivian noticed the small clock shop, the one where she had watched Walter embrace him weeks earlier, had a new sign in its window, announcing a closing sale on the remaining inventory, the paint on the lettering still fresh and hurried. When she mentioned it to Naomi, half in passing over a slice of pie neither of them had ordered but both were somehow eating, the truth came out with an ease that made Vivian's stomach drop. Miles had quietly sold his own private collection of antique watches and pieces he had spent 15 years hunting down at estate sales and auctions, and restoring by hand with the same patience he gave to every broken thing that crossed his workbench, some worth more than most people's cars. In order to cover the legal fees Vivian herself had been too proud to ask anyone for help with, he had done it without telling her. Routed the money through Ethan Mercer's office so it would arrive looking like nothing more than a resolved administrative fee, and never intended for her to learn where it had actually come from, certain she would refuse the help outright if she knew its source. Vivian confronted him about it on his own porch, holding the printed bank record Ethan had reluctantly confirmed after considerable pressing, her voice shaking with an emotion she had not expected to feel that strongly over a man she had known for such a short time. Miles simply shrugged, said the collection had been sitting in boxes for years anyway, said it plainly, as though giving away something he loved was no different than lending a neighbor a ladder for an afternoon. Vivian, without deciding to, without planning the gesture at all, crossed the porch and wrapped her arms around him, the way Walter had once wrapped his arms around a grieving 17-year-old boy on a cold winter night beside a frozen river. Miles stood still for a long moment, unused to being held rather than helping, his arms hovering uncertainly at his sides as though he had forgotten the shape of this particular gesture. Before his arms finally rose and settled around her shoulders in return, tentative at first and then steady, the way his hands always eventually found their way to steadiness, once he understood what a moment required of him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The rain starting again softly behind them, the porch light flickering against the wet street exactly as it had on the night this whole story began. Vivian pulled back eventually, wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, and told him she had made a decision, one she suspected would surprise the entire street once word got around. She was going to buy back the old clock shop, the one Walter had built and Miles had inherited in every way that mattered except paperwork, before it disappeared into someone else's closing sale, forever, and became nothing more than a storage unit or a nail salon. Miles opened his mouth to refuse, the way he refused nearly everything offered to him, his jaw already setting into the familiar shape of a man preparing to say no. But Vivian did not let him finish, holding up a hand the way she once did in boardrooms full of investors who thought they could outlast her patience. She told him she was not giving him charity, that she understood better than anyone the difference between a handout and a debt finally being repaid. "You spend your whole life fixing things other people gave up on," she said, watching his face carefully in the porch light, her voice steady despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "It's time somebody helped fix yours." Within a month, the paperwork was finalized. The old sign was repainted in careful gold lettering, and the shop that had once belonged to Walter Boone reopened under both of their names, though Miles insisted, quietly and firmly, that his stay smaller than hers on the sign, a small concession she allowed him without argument. The whole street turned out for the small reopening on a crisp Saturday morning. Naomi bringing pastries from her cafe still warm from the oven, Arthur standing on the sidewalk with his cane and a smile he rarely wore so openly, nodding to everyone who passed as though he had somehow orchestrated the whole thing himself. Inside, alongside the repair counter where Miles still bent over broken mechanisms every morning, Vivian had added a small seating area with good coffee and a modest display case for antique pieces, a business that honored both what Walter had built and what Miles had quietly become since losing it, blending the old world with something new neither of them had expected to build together. Walter himself, in a wheelchair now, but sharper that particular afternoon than he had been in months, sat by the window and watched his son work alongside a woman who had once knocked on a stranger's door in the rain, needing nothing more than a ride into town. Arthur, standing near the door with his coffee, said the only thing that needed saying that day, loud enough for half the room to hear over the pleasant noise of the small crowd. Sometimes, he told anyone listening, all it takes is one ride with the right person to change an entire life. A few people laughed softly. Others nodded in quiet agreement. And Vivian, catching Miles's eye across the busy shop, felt for the first time in nearly a year that she had landed somewhere solid enough to stay. There were harder days, too, in the months between the reopening and the wedding. Days that reminded Vivian that healing was never as clean as the stories people liked to tell about it afterward. There was an afternoon when a former business associate from the city tracked her down at the shop, smiling too widely, offering an investment opportunity that sounded suspiciously like the same arrangement that had ruined her the first time. Vivian felt her old instincts rise, the practiced charm, the reflexive politeness that had once cost her everything, and for a moment, she almost said yes, simply because saying no to people in expensive suits had never come naturally to her. It was Miles, standing quietly by the workbench with a watch case open in his hands, who caught her eye across the room and gave the smallest shake of his head, not a command, only a reminder that she already knew the answer. She thanked the man for stopping by, told him she was no longer interested in city ventures of any kind, and watched him leave with a lightness in her chest she had not expected to feel. There was another evening, closer to Walter's decline than either of them wanted to admit, when Miles came home from the nursing home, unusually quiet, sat down at the kitchen table, and did not touch his dinner. Vivian did not press him, remembering how carefully he had once given her the same courtesy on her hardest nights, and instead sat beside him in silence until he was ready to speak. He told her, eventually, that Walter had called him by his father's name that day, twice, and had not remembered it afterward, when Miles gently corrected him. It was the first time Vivian saw him afraid of something he could not fix with patience or tools, the first time the mechanism in front of him refused to respond no matter how carefully he turned it. She held his hand across the table and told him that some things were not meant to be repaired, only accompanied, and that showing up counted for more than he had ever let himself believe. Naomi and Arthur became something like family in those months as well. Arriving with soup on the evenings Vivian and Miles were too tired to cook, sitting on the porch some nights, simply to fill the quiet, with easier conversation. Arthur, in particular, took to visiting Walter himself on Sunday afternoons, the two old men trading stories about a town that had changed less than either of them expected over the decades, and Vivian often found Miles standing in the doorway afterward, watching them with an expression she had come to recognize as gratitude, too large for words. The street itself seemed to soften around the two of them as the months passed, neighbors leaving jars of preserves on their porch, children waving a little longer than they used to, the whole quiet corner of town gradually opening around a man who had spent so long keeping it politely at arm's length. Vivian understood, watching it happen, that she had not simply repaired a house or reclaimed a shop. She had, without quite meaning to, helped an entire town remember how to let someone back in. Miles and Vivian did not marry with fireworks or grand declarations, and neither of them ever felt they needed to, choosing instead a small ceremony in the shop's back garden the following spring, surrounded only by the people who had actually shown up for them when it mattered. They built something steadier instead of spectacle. A life measured out in small repaired mechanisms and small repaired trust, in mornings at the shop and evenings on the same porch where a wallet had once been returned in the rain to a stranger who had not yet learned to trust him. The old blue pickup truck stayed parked in the driveway, long after it was needed for anything practical. Kept not for its engine, but for what it represented, the first 15 minutes of a story neither of them had expected to begin that Thursday night. On the shop's counter, in a place of honor beside newer commissions, sat the very first watch Miles had ever fully restored under Walter's patient instruction decades earlier, its case scratched, its hands finally moving again, after years of stillness on a shelf in the back room. Customers sometimes asked about it, drawn to the careful engraving on its worn back plate, and Vivian would tell them, in the unhurried way she had learned from the man beside her, that some things simply need the right person to notice they were never truly broken, only waiting for someone patient enough to look closely. The second hand ticked forward steadily behind the glass, small and constant, the way certain quiet kindnesses keep moving long after the people who offered them have stopped counting the cost or expecting anything back. And somewhere beneath that ticking, in a town where the leaves fell early and the rain came often, and where a quiet man had spent 11 years fixing everyone's clocks but his own, two people who had each believed their best chances were behind them discovered, together, that it was never too late for the clock to start again. Walter lived long enough to see them married, long enough to watch Vivian learn to hold a loop steady the way Miles once had, long enough to call her daughter without ever once being corrected, and on quiet evenings, when the shop had closed and the street outside had gone dark and still, Miles and Vivian would sit together on the same porch where it had all begun, listening to the soft, steady ticking of 100 small clocks finally keeping time.